The next James Bond doesn't have a casting problem. He has a survival problem. Because the world that once protected him now documents him, records him, and quietly prepares to erase him the moment he becomes inconvenient. They're already arguing about which actor should wear the suit next, as if the problem is casting. As if replacing a face would somehow restore something that quietly stopped working a long time ago. Because the truth is the role itself has become the liability, not the man playing it. Because a James Bond who leaves bodies, CCTV footage, phone metadata, and international incidents behind him isn't a secret weapon anymore. He's a walking evidence file. The question isn't who becomes the next Bond. It's why the position still exists at all. In a world where intelligence no longer survives exposure, where attention is fatal, and where institutions don't collapse loudly, they retreat, they minimize, they erase. MI6 doesn't lose agents anymore. It loses plausibility. Because an operative like Bond only functions when the system can absorb the damage he causes. And that system no longer has the margin to pretend nothing happened. The first fracture appears in the way candidates are discussed. Younger, quieter, less iconic, less memorable. As if invisibility has become a requirement rather than a trait. Another pressure point lurks beneath the surface. One no one mentions because it's invisible until it's too late. Bond has always relied on improvisation. But improvisation in a world that records everything leaves a trail not just of proof, but of expectation. Every unplanned maneuver becomes precedent. Every unconventional solution becomes a template that authorities and adversaries alike can predict, analyze, and exploit. The very genius that once allowed him to escape danger now shapes the environment around him. He isn't just a man under surveillance. He is a blueprint for the next generation of operators. A catalogue of risk. A dossier that multiplies the consequences of each decision he ever made. And in this sense, the next Bond isn't stepping into a role. He's inheriting a liability. A legacy of visibility that the system itself can no longer tolerate. Every act of brilliance echoes backward, forcing MI6 to constrain, monitor, and segment the agent to preserve institutional survival. And the quietest fracture of all is the one nobody admits. The more effective Bond becomes, the less compatible he is with the very structure that empowered him, which signals a deeper shift. Because Bond was never meant to blend in. He was meant to be seen and survived anyway. That only worked when Bond could shoot someone in a casino, crash a car through a foreign capital, and leave the country before the paperwork caught up. And the fact that visibility itself is now treated as a flaw tells you the environment has turned hostile to the very idea of a singular agent. This leads directly into the first pressure point. Espionage in an era of total digital surveillance, where there is no off-grid movement, no unrecorded interaction, no clean extraction, and where every action creates data that cannot be burned, bribed, or buried. Every gunshot becomes a timestamp, every location ping becomes a trail, every cover identity becomes a liability the moment it's reused, which means the traditional Bond footprint doesn't fade, it accumulates, and the longer it exists, the more it exposes the institution that authorized it. In that context, MI6 doesn't fire Bond. It outgrows him, not forward, but inward, shrinking its risk profile until deniability becomes the only remaining defense. Because a visible hero is no longer a symbol of strength, he's a liability trail. The second fracture is more subtle and more corrosive. The license to kill was never about permission, it was about ownership. It allowed MI6 to say, this action was sanctioned without ever saying this was our decision. A controlled outlet for violence that allowed the state to decide when, where, and why force could be applied without consequence. And once that control weakens, the license stops being a tool and starts becoming evidence. A license killer in a world that documents everything doesn't represent authority, he represents intent. And intent is the one thing modern institutions cannot afford to have clearly traced back to them. That's why the concept of Bond hasn't been retired in universe. It's been diluted, fragmented, discussed as a legacy rather than a function. Because legacy absorbs blame without demanding accountability. And somewhere inside that dilution sits the discomfort no one names. That MI6 can no longer fully protect the person carrying that designation. Not from villains, but from inquiries, leaks, internal reviews, and governments that need someone to blame when an operation becomes public. Not from enemies, but from the record, from the archive, from the permanent memory of systems that never forget and never forgive. By this point, the shape of the problem is clear, even if it hasn't been spoken. Bond isn't outdated because the world became safer. He's outdated because the world became traceable. And traceability turns myth into liability, identity into exposure, and exposure into institutional risk. The more the franchise gestures toward continuation, the more it reveals the pressure underneath. A need to keep the symbol while abandoning the structure that made it viable. Which is why the conversation feels strangely hollow, focused on aesthetics rather than function, presence rather than consequence. And if all of this feels like an absence rather than a transition, that's because it is. A controlled withdrawal masked as renewal, which means the next Bond film isn't about saving the world. It's about surviving the system that created him. A quiet acknowledgement that the kind of Agent Bond represents no longer fits inside the system that created him. Not because he failed, but because he worked too well for too long, leaving damage that can no longer be denied or erased. That absence changes how everything around the franchise reads, because once you notice it, the stories stop feeling like endings and start feeling like containment. Narratives designed to close doors rather than open futures. This reframes why continuity itself has become unstable, why it is reset instead of evolve, because progression would require acknowledging accumulation, and accumulation would force the system to admit responsibility for decades of sanctioned chaos. So instead, identity becomes modular, interchangeable, reduced to surface traits. This is why the next Bond doesn't need a legend, a history, or even permanence. He needs to be reversible. Someone who can be activated, blamed, and erased without destabilizing the institution that deployed him. Accent, posture, silhouette, while the function underneath quietly dissolves. The pressure builds when you realize this isn't just about one agent. It's about the disappearance of a role, because roles only survive when they can be protected, and protection now requires erasure rather than extraction. A spy who officially exists is a problem. A spy who can be named is a risk. And a spy who becomes iconic is catastrophic, because icons demand protection, and protection is exactly what modern intelligence agencies can no longer afford to provide without exposing themselves. Which turns the old fantasy on its head, the idea that fame equals invulnerability, when now it equals exposure. The unsettling part is that none of this requires betrayal, conspiracy, or moral collapse. It's simply what happens when systems optimized for silence collide with a world built on permanent records. Bond doesn't lose his place because he's obsolete as a man. He loses it because the system can no longer plausibly deny him, and denial has always been its most valuable weapon. There's a hidden domino no one is talking about. The next Bond is entering a world where enemies don't wait for mistakes, they exploit history. Every adversary now has access not just to intelligence, but to decades of precedent set by the agent himself. Every mission, every improvisation, every rogue decision is catalogued, cross-referenced, and weaponized. The more legendary Bond becomes, the more predictable he is to the people who want him gone. This means survival isn't about skill, luck, or gadgets. It's about whether Mi-6 can rewrite history fast enough to shield him. And if they fail, the next 007 could be hunted not by villains, but by the ghosts of every success he ever achieved. The myth becomes the trap, and the hero becomes the liability, and once that weapon is gone, the only move left is to step back, redraw the boundary, and let the figure at the center fade into something that technically still exists, but can no longer be fully claimed, protected, or even acknowledged in the same way. And that raises the real question the franchise hasn't asked out loud yet. Not who the next Bond is, but whether Mi-6 even wants a Bond who can't be denied anymore.